Christmas morning. A layer of frost sparkled on every twig and car in the sleepy village of Woodley-on-Brook. The sun barely peeked above the horizon, stubborn and pale, as if even the sky wanted to stay tucked in bed. But in one cheery brick house, Peppa, now a lively, adventurous adult, was already bustling about in her striped pajamas, stirring hot chocolate and humming carols, wearing her favorite Santa hat askew. Peppa had been talking about the Christmas swim for weeks. It was a village tradition, one she'd never dared to attempt as a child, but she'd made a promise. This year, she would jump into the freezing cold lake with her friends. And nothing says Merry Christmas quite like a self-inflicted icy shock, right? She'd texted her usual group the night before. George, her fun-loving younger brother, now an adult with a quick wit, Susie, her best friend, plus impromptu event coordinator, Danny, always up for a laugh, sometimes to his own regret. Emily, sensible until egged on, and Pedro, who was already inventing an excuse to just watch as support. It was only 7:30 a.m. when Peppa's kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and the jangle of bells. Susie lumbered in first, armed with a tartan thermos and an alarming amount of energy for such an early hour. She was already suited up, woolly hat, goggles, a Christmas jumper draped over her swimsuit, and a scarf nearly down to her knees. "You look like you got dressed while falling down a flight of stairs," Peppa grinned, shoving a mug into Susie's hand. Susie shrugged. "It's called layering. Fashionable, practical, and utterly necessary if we want to survive this." George arrived next, rubbing frost from his beard and looking like he'd barely escaped his duvet's grasp. He'd brought what he called his swimming trunks, which turned out to be a pair of ill-advised novelty shorts covered in holly print. "Optimistic, aren't you?" Susie said, raising an eyebrow as George shivered exaggeratedly. Danny and Emily tumbled in, already arguing over whose hat was more ridiculous. Danny's, undoubtedly, featured a pair of plastic antlers that jangled with every movement. And Pedro, trailing quietly at the end, was tightly swaddled in so many scarves he looked as though he'd been packaged for shipping. "Pedro, sure you want to come?" Peppa teased, handing him a cup. He considered. "If I collapse from cold, I expect at least 4 emergency blankets." Everyone laughed, some more nervously than others. By 8 a.m., they were trudging toward the lake, steam floating from their mugs and breath. The streets were empty. Most villagers were still tucked in, awaiting roast dinners and presents, not anticipating a dip in near-freezing water. At the water's edge, a dozen other adults gathered, shifting from foot to foot, some in robes, most in festive hats, all eyeing the icy expanse with varying degrees of enthusiasm and dread. A little wooden sign announced, "Woodley Christmas Swim. No lifeguard, just bravery and tea." "Lovely," Emily said dryly. "Should we warm up first?" One of the regulars, a burly, bearded man in an elf hat, led everyone in a 10-second round of jumping jacks, which did very little except dislodge Pedro's scarves and send Danny's antlers flying. "Right. Who's first?" the elf hat boomed. A hush. Peppa cleared her throat. "We'll all go together," she announced, suddenly unsure if her voice shook from nerves or cold. Susie grabbed her hand. "If we perish as one." It was as if they were about to face a firing squad. Shoes, hats, scarves, well, most of them came off, and a makeshift clothes pile formed on the muddy bank. Peppa glanced at her friends. They all looked ridiculous, goosebumps and mismatched swimsuits, but determined and united. 3, 2, 1. Merry Christmas. The charge down the slipway felt endless. Icy mud squelched between their toes. There was a collective shriek, the kind only produced by adults with questionable judgment, then darkness as the icy water swallowed them. Shock, absolute and complete, took hold. The lake felt like liquid pins and needles. Susie let out a yelp. George managed a kind of war cry. Emily gasped out something unprintable, and Pedro's face twisted in a rictus of disbelief. Peppa felt her mind go utterly blank except for the overwhelming cold. Then, by force of will, she burst to the surface, gulping air and laughing in the same breath. Somewhere, Danny was already making for the shore, moving with a speed that would have impressed any Olympic coach. 20 seconds later, the world had contracted into a blur of splashes, flailing arms, and Christmas hats drifting away on the current. But then, something extraordinary happened. Time slowed. The initial misery mutated into a rush, adrenaline, and shared experience, knitting them together. The bite of the cold gave way to giddy laughter. Emily, who'd sworn she'd never do this, was bellowing carols at the sky. 12 Days of Christmas, delivered mostly off-key. Susie attempted breaststroke, forgot how to coordinate her arms, and briefly resembled a kind of aquatic windmill. George threw water at Danny, who shrieked and dove back under solely to escape another attack. Even Pedro seemed to brighten, red-cheeked and triumphant.